Hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Nicole Forbes and you are watching Dennis's 70s class today covering hedgerows. Um, we are taking kind of a new spin on a normally pretty popular topic, and that's just privacy screens and hedges to illustrate a sustainable and more habitat generating uh, planting called mixed hedgerow. And the planting style that we are talking about is a little bit unique in that it is a purposefully dense or close planting. So we're going to plant our plants fairly close together and allow them to kind of grow into one another, ultimately forming a wall or a screen that creates more of a barrier. Now, of course, the idea as well with a mixed hedgerow is that we are creating a layered planting. So with the effect of kind of tiers or tiering, as well as a linear or kind of horizontal run of plants. Now, typically what most of us see as property line barriers or perimeter markers in most landscapes are a very traditional hedge, possibly arborvitae, laurel hedges are used quite often, boxwood hedges, etc. And these hedges that we have more modernly been using are a single species, more of a uniform planting. They may also be planted purposefully somewhat close together, but they're all one species of plant, kind of trimmed, or sometimes they're allowed to grow untrimmed, but usually trimmed to kind of maintain in a restrained space and size. One of the potential downfalls of this modern hedging is that it is more prone to disease or insect infestation or an outbreak that, should your hedge become sick, the entire hedge may be vulnerable to that very same threat, which could become more devastating in the long run to your, whole privacy screen or aesthetic than having a mixed range of species in that hedgerow, which have less or different vulnerability should you encounter a condition such as a disease or a pest. So in addition to kind of that obvious downfall when you have one single species, the vulnerability of that single species in a hedge, another critical aspect of the difference between a standard or modern hedge single species and a mixed hedgerow, as we're talking about today, is the availability of a diverse range of plant species, flowering times, fruit and seed offering, as well as seasonal changes that allow a mixed hedgerow to offer habitat to birds, butterflies, beneficial insects, and pollinators, in addition to even other, obviously squirrels and other small mammals. It can also help create the similar feelings or effects that our standard or modern hedges do. So delineate property lines, create privacy screens, wind breaks in a larger piece of property. The mixed hedgerow can be placed so that, of course, it buffers wind, sound. If you've got a road and a lot of sound nearby, that nice big dense mixed hedgerow planting can help buffer sound. And when you're a windbreak as well, a lot of weed seeds and invasive weeds potentially can be blown into your property with the wind. So by creating windbreaks and buffers, you can also reduce the potential for invasive weeds in your garden and help manage storm water runoff or just water management in the soil by that nice dense planting or overplanting and the layers in that canopy. So this mixed hedgerow concept is not a new idea in any way. It has been used since medieval Europeans made cuttings of hawthorn and stuck the hawthorn cuttings in the ground, and as those hawthorn trees grew, they would cut them at about 6-8 feet tall, and then the new growth that comes out after being pruned, they would kind of weave into one another so that the plants all grew together and created a dense thicket that became even often impenetrable to livestock, but certainly became that nice hedge, or what they call the haga, which is Old English for hawthorn. So here, hedge literally comes, our term hedge comes from this very practice, and the increased habitat that those ancient hedgerows offered created again home for wide population of songbirds and beneficial insects. And for most, especially rural properties, farmers and gardeners, we know that we have a critical relationship with the birds and the beneficial insects as insect control, of like aphids and things in our garden. So birds typically eat bugs. And so if you've got, again, a diverse population and you're bringing in more of those beneficials to your garden, the maintenance and the overall kind of ecosystem tends to run on its own patterns and take less input from you. So it ends up as a lower maintenance garden. Now, establishing and maintaining a hedgerow is probably the only drawback, and why we don't see more hedgerows planted out in landscapes. It's not as easy as digging one linear trough or trench that then you lay in your arborvitae or laurel at the prescribed spacing, fill it in, fertilize and water, and just let that hedge grow until you first start to manicure and box it into a little wall. The difference in planting a hedgerow is that because we are purposefully planting more intensely closer together, there will be early on more competition amongst the plants for especially water. So we need to water and mulch the area to make sure that all of the individual roots are getting a chance to get established and get the moisture that they need. Ultimately, over time, the hedgerow, the stories, the upper story, mid-story, and then the lower kind of ground cover and spreading understory of the hedgerow shade out the soil enough to not only help create a living mulch that holds in moisture, but also crowds out weed growth and unwanted plant growth because of that nice dense canopy of overgrowth of the plants that you actually want there. It's ideal that a hedgerow planting, no matter how many linear feet you have, maybe it's running the back of your property line, it's 30 feet long, for example. Ideally, you can allow the depth of the bed to be at least 6 feet deep. So that would be front to the fence or front to the property line. 6 feet of depth in planting, and that 30 linear feet, or however you want. That deep of a bed will allow you to plant several layers of plants into that space, rather than, again, most modern hedges start with a planting strip that is often half that width, so a depth. So maybe 3 feet for your arborvitae hedge that you're installing. So we do give up a bit of extra space in the depth of a mixed hedgerow so that we are able to achieve that layered effect. And just behind me, and I'll get into more about the plants that I brought in today, but behind me you can see a little bit of the intentional layering effect that we can create from a hedgerow. Not only do we have a mixed range of species that go into the hedgerow, but we have also a range of evergreen, conifers, and broadleaf evergreens and conifers, and deciduous plants or shrubs that drop their leaves. We also have some faster growing plants, some moderate growing plants, and a few slow growing plants to not have everything just kind of fill in at the same pace, but to allow a little bit of a natural tiering based off of just the average growth rate of the plants. So behind me in the corner you see there's a lovely western red cedar or Hogan cedar. This is a very common tree in our area that is average height, I guess, would be about 20 feet, but you could see it get up to a good 40 to 50 feet. The cedar is an evergreen and a moderate to fast grower, and this would be one of those trees that you would ideally site into the back of your hedgerow and into a space where you can allow that tree to gain some vertical height, and then it will ultimately probably shade out the plants around it as it grows. So those plants will need to either tolerate partial shade that are close up to the cedar, or they will be plants that ultimately will be able to weave out into more sun or even be transplanted as the cedar grows larger. The next layer down, so we have like a 25 feet and above layer, for example. The next layer down would be like 25 feet and under, but typically still plants that can tolerate some sun. And then the third layer down would be below 25 feet. Now that could be like 8 to 12 feet tall. Those are usually, again, kind of the upper end of a lot of our really common landscape shrubs or native plants. It's ideal with that 6 feet of width or depth of that planting space that you're going to do 3 or 4 or even more rows of plantings within that space. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be like stadium effect. You know, it's not going to be like row upon row upon row. So you can stagger your plants within that planting so that they aren't side by side and completely packed in there, but they will be somewhat on the crowded side. Also, using evergreens, especially if this is a privacy screen in the long run, in addition to a property line marker and that kind of thing, is inside the house. You need to look out and choose those sight lines from your window in the house and make sure that those evergreens, for example, are placed within the sight lines to give you that year-round privacy that you want, and making the best use, again, of the tall and the evergreen in that consideration of what you see inside the house. Now, ideally, it's okay to top some of these plants to allow them to fill out down below, unless you want it to be one of the taller growing of the back layer. But you want to choose plants that all have similar sun and water requirements, plants that are happy in the same soil conditions as well, both fertility and water and drainage. And then again, realizing, of course, that the upper story of plants will potentially over time shade or create some shade for the lower story of plants. Once the young hedgerow is planted, the maintenance, as I mentioned, so soaker hoses and keeping it well watered for the first 2 years, and then supplemental watering in that third hot summer especially, with a nice low deep soaking, so not a sprinkler system necessarily, but a nice soaker hose to give it that deep soaking. And then at least a good 3-inch layer of mulch on top of the planting space will help all of that root competition maintain kind of a cooler temperature and to keep the moisture in the bed itself. So research has shown that a 3-inch thick layer of mulch reduces moisture evaporation from the soil by 30% which is a significant enough amount that I think it's worth, the effort of throwing some mulch down. Other than that watering and the mulching, we, of course, would do a soil test to see if you have any specific fertility issues within the soil. But just an all-purpose organic fertilizer, a slow release, is better than trying to really, juice the hedge with some sort of, triple 16 or 20, where that's too much rocket fuel, often creates really flappy, soft growth on your plants and can even lead to insect infestations, because aphids love nothing more than really soft, fleshy tissue from plants that, it comes from spring new growth examples. So the kind of slower and hardier new growth that comes out from the more organic type fertilizers is, again, more sustainable and doesn't kind of bring on that pest issue that really fast growing instigating fertilizer like high nitrogen can often do that. So push too much soft growth and cause aphids to come. It is from there like a weed control issue while you're waiting for your plants to fill in. So early season, for the first several years on a hedgerow, it is either prudent to again kind of patrol that mulch layer to make sure that any weed seeds that might be emerging or blow in and start to sprout from the mulch layer, get those weed seeds pulled. Or another thing that I really like to do is, while a hedgerow is young, you can sow wildflower seeds, for example, into the mulch itself. And it's one of the best ways to use wildflower seeds and some space between more permanent plantings. Wildflower seeds are great to sow in the fall, actually, when a wildflower naturally would lay its own seed down. That would be at the end of summer or fall. But if you've missed the opportunity, you could still sow a can or a big packet of wildflower seeds this time of year, but get them soon. And then if you do it in the fall, you've got this nice, moist and wetted, extended wet period to water those plants. This time of year, you may need to, give them supplemental water as they come up and it starts to get a little bit drier and warmer for spring. But wildflowers mostly are annual or biennial plants. So although they come up and they grow fast, they won't be there permanently, which means that you will have less work in trying to get rid of them or move them when competition becomes more intense by the more permanent plantings in your hedgerow. Lots of options on wildflowers range from, pollinator attracting collections, hummingbird collections. We have Northwest native wildflowers or more shade tolerant wildflowers. So we actually do carry a pretty good selection of wildflower seed mixes here, especially this time of year. So consider that. It's a really great way to, again, kind of temporarily use or borrow space while you're waiting for your more permanent plants to fill in over time. Now, there's not a prescription or a list or, the right group of plants to use for a hedgerow. I think that that's one of the greatest things about it. I mean, if you drive around and look at other modern hedges, there's like 5 choices out there pretty much. It's, English laurel or some type of laurel. There's boxwood. There's arborvitae. And sometimes you see like a euonymus or something interesting, maybe a bamboo. That's about it for what we see as, and what most people want for a hedge: fast growing, evergreen, shapeable or prunable, and tolerant of a wide range of conditions. So those are the criteria often that when people come in looking for a privacy screen or a hedge. Those are some of the things that they want. If you think about the opportunities that you have in a mixed hedgerow planting, the range of plants that you can put together is almost endless. So of course there are, tree-like plants as well as, going with different shapes is great, because if you think of a lilac or a rose of Sharon or another small tree, you could have a more upright vase-shaped plant. And in an intense planting arrangement, you can make use of plants' shapes to sort of pack more plants in together to create that dense layering. So upright and vase-shaped, we can have more rounded plants kind of tucked in to that lower understory of the upright vase-shaped trees. And of course, behind the upright and vase-shaped trees and a few accents, something upright and evergreen with a taller story like our cedar. You could do a evergreen magnolia. Obviously, if you already have, Doug firs or some of the larger trees, you may have the upper canopy taken care of. But as many trees grow, they will limb themselves up over time, kind of shading out the lower branches and developing a trunk that then you just look, right through, and there's your privacy gone. So then filling in that understory with the next layer would be, as I mentioned, things that kind of fill in and are more rounded or can be shaped. Beyond that, of course, the next layer down could be more of that 6-8 foot or even 4 to 6 foot layer of tall and wide plants. And then even that 4th or 5th layer is the final border plants, which could be grasses, flowering perennials, native understory plants that are, common, like yarrow and bleeding heart and some of those fun natives. So here behind me, a few of them, and some that we listed out on your handout. I will talk about which ones are on that are native plants, but really one of the, I have a hard copy of this, but a really great resource is actually the Portland plant list. And so especially if you're looking to use or incorporate native plants into your mixed hedgerow, consulting the Portland plant list, which is available online as well as to purchase a copy. What they do is they talk about each plant in detail and sort of arrange or affiliate them into basic kind of tribes or communities as well. So that helps you then put plants together by consulting this list that thrive in similar environments or that appreciate the same conditions and grow as a community. So a really great resource if you're in Portland, obviously, or in the Portland metro area. And beyond that, we do have a great selection of native plants that are available for hedgerow plantings and do magically well combined together just due to their kind of native affiliations. It is such a busy shipping time here at the garden center that we have lots and lots of plant material that are just arriving on a daily basis. So multiple trucks come every day and lots of inventory is still rolling in. So some of these items that I cannot show to you today, I will list out on the handout and mention, and by the way, handout's attached to the video up at the description. You'll see all of these on the handout, and soon you will be able to see all of these at the garden center, if not now. But the availability changes, as I mentioned, as we get closer and closer to spring. Now, beyond the cedar that I showed in the back level, I like to have a couple of plants in the mixed hedgerow that are fast growing, which may mean that over time the fast growing plants might need to be pruned or slightly controlled to respect the slower or more moderate growing plants around them, just so that they're not like bullies in the hedgerow. but fast growing plants at least can help really fill in some space and give you the sense of accomplishment or achievement for this that otherwise becomes a little bit of a delayed gratification, because in reality it can take 4 to 7 years to really establish a mixed hedgerow to the point where it feels thick and lush and sort of is working in its own, on its own energy and as its own kind of system without your involvement. So a couple of fast growing plants in there can't hurt. One of the prettiest and fast growing plants this time of year that's in bloom at the moment is our gorgeous golden forsythia. So forsythia is a deciduous shrub that blooms on bare wood in the kind of late winter, early spring. So it blooms on its previous year's growth and can easily put on 3 to 4 feet in a single year, but be contained smaller, so prune after it blooms is the ideal way to maintain on forsythia. Now it can become a 6 to 8 foot tall and wide, nice rounded open plant. It is easy to either trim up some of the bottom of a rounded plant such as forsythia to allow you to have an underlayer planted underneath that 8 foot shrub. So you could do a 4 or 3 foot layer in front of and kind of under that by lifting it up just a little bit. If you leave forsythia's branches to grow onto the ground, if you let that rounded plant kind of trail along the ground with some stems, they will actually root back down over time and kind of what's called air layering or layer to create more plant and end up as a thicket. So if you wanted that forsythia to run into a portion of the hedgerow, allow those lower branches to grow low to the ground and even kind of pin them to the ground or cover a portion of the stem with a little bit of soil to stimulate those roots to develop, and the plant will actually kind of run with multiple touchdowns and have roots and kind of continue itself in more of a linear fashion. Quite a few of these plants you can allow to do that if you want that ultimate thicket effect where the plants are truly running kind of into and growing into one another. Forsythia drops its leaves in the fall and it sticks through the winter. And I think that that is fantastic if you plan it well in your hedgerow, because that allows winter light to penetrate into darker spaces. That'll either get other flowers or plants underneath, in the underplantings to bloom or grow. But honestly, in my opinion, in winter, just light is a premium. I would almost rather sacrifice a little bit of privacy to have a little bit of sunlight in my property. When you are in the Pacific Northwest, it's gray quite often, and so having that sun is almost more important to me. So the deciduous allows the sunlight in, and before forsythia drops its leaves in the winter, its foliage turns like purples and plums and burgundy colors. So really pretty fall color, and then it's all gone. So fast growing, early season blooming. It's great to even cut pieces of forsythia and bring them into the house for, flower arranging and that kind of thing. And our pollinators do visit it, so bees enjoy the fact that it's an early bloomer too. Another fast grower that looks great in the hedgerow is buckthorn. This is variegated buckthorn. Now this is Rhamnus alternatus variegata. It is another of the fast growing plants to fill in space. However, this is, for our area, this is a broadleaf evergreen. So it keeps its leaves through the winter, which can make it a little bit vulnerable to like intense winter winds or extreme cold spells. Now again, if it is within a intensely planted hedgerow with other larger plants kind of helping to buffer the wind, it may not experience the same type of intense wind conditions that can dry out these evergreen leaves as if it were out in full exposure on its own. I have one at home that gets east winds from the gorge, and this last winter storm, some of its leaves are kind of frost tipped and ugly looking, and at this time of year it's shedding a lot of those old icky leaves, so that as it puts out new growth, it's kind of doing a repair and exchange situation. So it took a hit. It's not as pretty at the moment, but it's coming out of it with a nice flush of new spring growth. Variegated buckthorn is just about it's kind of in flower right now. It does make a small berry that songbirds enjoy. So the berry is more like a seed and capsule berry, and that would be late summer into fall. If it doesn't look bad from winter stress, it is also really pretty to cut and bring into arrange with flowers in a vase. But a fast growing plant, again, you'll see 2 feet, at least, so more than a foot a year, up to 8, even 10 feet tall, and another that is a little bit, it's taller than wide over time and can certainly be trained into a small tree effect. So you can allow it to grow wide and untrimmed. It'll be almost as wide as it is tall. Count on it definitely being at least 8, and it certainly can get up to 10. Due to the quick growth of the buckthorn, I have found that occasionally it does not root in extremely well. So another word of caution, since we've all just gone through the ice storm that toppled so many trees and shrubs and things, it can occasionally be pulled out of the ground or toppled or heaved out in really heavy ice because it just doesn't have a super deep root system. But that's, hopefully these ice storms come once every 40 years or whatever, so we have just had ours. So Rhamnus variegata, really pretty, great for that filler, evergreen, faster growing, full sun or partial sun, and drought tolerant once established. Not a native, but again, just a really handsome looking plant. Another that's moderate growing, but also about to come into bloom and really attractive. Oh, and really heavy. This is Birkwood osmanthus. I think maybe sweet olive might be a common name for it, but it doesn't really have a very common name. Birkwood osmanthus is used quite frequently in England as a hedge plant. Now, we try to emulate a lot of other things that English gardens do, like their flowers and, all of that. So I don't know why we don't use osmanthus more in our hedges or hedgerows. It's a moderate grower, not the fastest grower, so I suppose maybe that's reason number one. Americans are less patient, perhaps. I don't know, that's a generality, not fair. It is really a pretty flower, and it has like a jasmine fragrance, so it's sweetly scented. It's evergreen. It's a handsome plant that can easily get 6-7 feet tall and about as wide, but it can be pruned to be maintained more narrow if you wanted. The flowers are white and kind of in small clusters of white tubes that, as I mentioned, are fragrant. And they're budded up to bloom now. They'll be in flower within another week to 2 weeks. If you wanted to prune on the osmanthus, you would prune again just after it finished blooming to avoid taking too many flowers away. And you could create more of a narrow screen out of it and allow that nice, upright, kind of wispy habit that it has up top. Again, like 7 by 7 in 7 years is a good example. So not exactly a foot a year, a little less than that, but a gorgeous plant nonetheless. An evergreen, as I mentioned. moderate growing as well, but another just sturdy, reliable, drought tolerant, easy care plants. This is Viburnum tinus. This happens to be spring bouquet, I believe, which is just a little bit of a fleshier flower. In the viburnum family, we have a lot of choices in our landscape plants, and so many of you may already be familiar with or may already have viburnum in the garden. The new growth on viburnum is sort of a coppery, peachy color, real pretty. The rest of the year, it's just got a hardy green leaf that is evergreen through winter, and then it creates a pink flower bud, often in fall, but certainly by early spring, a pink flower bud that then opens to a white flower cluster. And quite often the flower cluster will then ripen to a really cool kind of powder blue or metallic blue seed berry. Not like a blueberry, not fleshy and messy, but a little hard seed in there. Again, songbirds enjoy it. Pollinators will come. This is a perfect shape for a butterfly even to feed off of. So the flowers do offer nectar. It is a rounded 8 by 8, but again, a moderate grower. So right into that same kind of back layer or range with the Osmanthus bergwii, for example. But I would keep it a little bit rounder and not try to hedge it as much. This plant also often blooms in the fall with a similar flower that it does in the early spring. So it's green all summer, but kind of bookended with these fun little nice flower clusters in spring and fall. The next kind of layer, again, that mid to front layer could include some twigged dogwood. And we get into some of our Oregon native or Pacific native plants, as well as cultivars of native plants with twig dogwood, Oregon grape, and Oregon grape comes as our standard tall Oregon grape, like 6-8 foot tall Oregon grape. There's compact Oregon grape, which is more like 4 feet tall. And then there's a low spreading Oregon grape that grows along the ground to about 18 inches. And all three of those sizes are excellent native plants to tuck into the various tiers of your mixed hedgerow. Not only are they evergreen, Oregon grape, they are early blooming, and so that is a bright yellow flower that is, again, very attractive to hummingbirds, pollinators, not so much butterflies, but hummingbirds and pollinators. And then it does produce a fruit, like a little grape-looking berry that comes after the flowers that, if, it's edible, but you can also let the songbirds and other critters eat it. So Oregon grape, one of our natives, goes great as well with twig dogwood, which is obviously an evergreen, a fast to moderate growing plant that can give us some of that vertical accent, although again some light in the wintertime. The fun of a twig dogwood is, again, we can allow it to fill in some of that higher space in the back or medium layer of the hedgerow, yet if it gets larger than you want, it can be pruned extremely hard. So you could take it almost to the ground for control. And when you prune twig dogwood in that sense, what it actually does, again, similar to letting the forsythia run, is it stimulates growth to come up from the soil around the original main trunk, creating more growth from the base. Gives you, again, a thicket effect. Instead of one place where the plant comes out and grows, you end up with multiple stems in doing a much better job at mitigating stormwater runoff, doing a much better job at erosion control, for example, if these are some of the goals, ultimately, of what you would like to see your mixed hedgerow achieve as well. So, based off of kind of the pruning technique for the twig dogwoods, you can get them again, to do that kind of thicket or running effect as well. And when you prune them, I always say just use the prunings in, again, cut flowers or bouquets or arrangements. They're really colorful and attractive, and they last a long time in vases and water. So it's also often possible, depending on the time of year that you take cuttings, that if you did prune on the twig dogwood, you may even be able to use a little bit of rooting powder or root stimulator and re-root those twig dogwood cuttings further down in your hedgerow to give you, again, that multiple effect of just starting similar to how the early Europeans did with the hawthorn, to place those in and allow the plants to grow together in that sense. Another cultivar of natives that I brought in that I love to use in a mixed hedgerow and is blooming this time of year, and it's so pretty. This is the red flowering currant. This is actually the King Edward VII cultivar of our native red flowering currant, which would just be Ribes sanguineum, so not exactly native, but there are native forms of this. Red flowering currant is deciduous, so it drops its leaves in the winter and is really early blooming also. So we've got flower buds that have formed up towards the top of the plant and some actual flowers that are coming out down low on the plant. And one of the definite benefits of this plant is that hummingbirds just go bonkers over it. So it's one of the favorites of our local hummingbird, and we both have Anna, who's been with us all winter long. Anna hummingbird stays in the Portland area through the winter, and the Rufus hummingbird, which is just coming back from Mexico about this time of year, is probably super hungry after a long trip. So you'll be able to find both Anna's and Rufus hummingbirds are thrilled to see that the Ribes, the currants, are in bloom or about to be in bloom. They will be camping out on these plants. This is considered a moderate grower, close to a foot a year or averaging around a foot a year at the most, and easily 6 to 8 feet tall. Some currants can grow even larger than that. They tend to, again, be almost as wide as they are tall, but they can be trained somewhat to have the effect of a small tree. You could kind of identify a small, more singular trunk on the currant and then keep the top more as a taller tree, giving you, again, that space to underplant closer to it for that mixed hedgerow effect. So early spring bloom, and then after that it just has a pretty little green leaf through the spring and summer, drops its leaves in the fall. It is one of my favorites. Couple of additional conifers. Here I've got a little Chamaecyparis piscifera. This is a rounded, moderate growing conifer that can actually get up to about 5 by 5. So nice kind of space fillers. We know, again, something with this evergreen but loose habit can provide a lot of ground feeding birds with opportunities to hop around for insects and grubs that may be in the leaf litter below a nice evergreen like that, and it gives it some shelter and a sense of safety when the birds are hopping around underneath those branch conifers. Also, I brought a couple of yews. This yew is Hicks. This is the Hicks yew, or Taxus hicksii. Hicks yew is one of the more upright and vertical styles of yews. So this has a columnar kind of upright habit like you see. A yew is on the slow growing side, but this one could ultimately end up at about 12 feet tall, but only at 12 feet tall, maybe be 3-4 feet wide. So a nice kind of narrow accent in the spaces right where, the window lines up with your neighbor's window, something like that. A nice kind of vertical yew, evergreen, narrow and dense over time. Not only does that give you kind of reliable privacy, but use our really tough plants, very drought tolerant. They are somewhat shade tolerant and also provide some nice habitat in that kind of nice tight center of the U plant. The only other ones that I brought in today and some of these aren't on your list because like I said, there is no list when it comes to mixed hedgerows unless you wanted to plant by community using native plants recommended through Association of the Portland Plant List, or choose, you could choose all plants that you can cut flowers from, for example, do a whole cut flower mixed hedgerow. You could grow food into your mixed hedgerow. So I think I mentioned raspberries or caneberries do already tend to grow kind of like a thicket. Don't do blackberries. Blackberries again seem like a great idea, and then they are the bully of the whole planting, and really hard to maintain a blackberry amongst other plants without having the blackberry kind of take over and be a thug. So choose wisely, choose plants again that are going to behave well together and not be overly aggressive. Fig trees are great in mixed hedgerows. You could also do columnar apple trees, or apple, cherry, pear, plum, but again, these would probably be plants that you're going to prune to a shorter size to use kind of the backyard orchard care style of, topping them and keeping a smaller plant with fruit bearing that's easier to pick, because the bigger it gets, the more shade you'll have of all these fruit trees, and then they won't produce very well in the long run. So fruit trees do need sun. That just, most fruit needs sun when you consider where it goes in the hedgerow. A couple of slower growing plants are fine, adding them in, because ultimately they will achieve their size, but you aren't like super counting on them. And in the meantime, it's kind of nice to have either like a pop of the accent color, but maybe I'm not fully ready for this to be 8 feet tall where it is. This is a golden hemlock, and it's again just an example of the foliage color, foliage texture. We can have a lot of interest and beauty in a hedgerow instead of having it be something that you just kind of don't really look at or see, like a solid standard screen or privacy screen. This is Golden Duke, which is an eastern hemlock that is a slow grower. It can ultimately end up at about 8 feet tall and almost 8 feet wide. But again, just these golden accents on the top of the kind of top branches, a little bit more muted inside where it's in less sun. A little bit of sun on this plant will keep it bright and colorful, but even so, it's sort of a light green underneath, which is also a good contrast against the dark greens. And the last one that I have that I think is so pretty, but would definitely be the front row, or the row right before the front row. And this is another type of Oregon grape, or Mahonia. This is a variety called Narahira. So Mahonia Narahira is an evergreen, full to partial sun, and tolerates quite a bit of shade. This is, Mahonias tend to be really a drought tolerant plant once established, so a great plant for conserving water and growing amongst other plants that are in a similar fashion. The foliage on this one turns a little bit of kind of a burgundy or plum in the wintertime, but then greens back up in the spring, and it has already bloomed in the fall. It bloomed with these long wands of kind of a butter yellow, not quite as gold as the yellow on our standard Oregon grape, kind of a butter yellow. The little berries that form, these have already maybe been mostly eaten, or maybe it didn't form very good berries this year, but I can see one little fruit that's hanging on there. There's a couple more fruits down here that do kind of look like grapes or blueberries. So ultimate size on this variety of Oregon grape is about 3 to 5 feet tall, but it's more upright and narrow, so maybe 2, 3 feet wide at that, 5 feet tall. It has this great kind of ferny, divided leaf that gives us kind of a feathery, ferny texture, which again I think is really lovely in the garden and combines well with some of the other foliage that we use in the mixed hedgerow, as well as providing, a different type of flower and a different type of fruit that will feed our local bird and insect populations. So, sorry about that. So I encourage you, of course, to check the handout and reach out to me if you have any type of questions on what do I think of this combination. If you're trying to come up with a hedgerow planting, I would love to assist. If you are in the Portland metro area, I am available for home consultation visits, and so if that's something of interest, check our website for details. You can find it under garden coaching. The next week we will be taking a break from classes, but we will see you in the first week of April to talk about spring container garden makeovers. So if you've got some pots that are sitting around on the deck or the patio and they're looking tired and need to be refreshed for the year, stay tuned for a couple weeks from now when we will be talking about what to do with those old tired containers and how to make them really look great this season. Other than that, I will answer questions that haven't already been answered after the video, and as always, thank you for watching. Happy gardening.